Welcome to the AirCon Vault. Here you can find recordings of the live streams from Eric's audio conference. These are made free thanks to our sponsors. A sound effect, Audio Kinetic, Boom Library, Bright Skull, Dolby, FMOD, Game Audio Learning, Game SoundCon, Kilohertz, Motion Picture Sound Editors, Rev Rooms, Sound Cuts, Sound Warriors, and Airwiggles, the online home for audio creatives. We hope you enjoy the video.
Hi, everyone. I cannot see any of you in a chat, but I have been told you are there. So I'll go ahead and get started. I'm going to talk about the sound and music of Life Below, which is a game I've worked on for the past 3 years. So it's very special to me at this point. I learned a lot and had a lot of creative liberties and resources on this project. So I thought it would be nice to share some of the things I learned and some of my process working on the game. So for most of you who probably don't know who I am, I'm Julie Buchanan. I'm a game audio designer who's been doing this for about 12 years now. I do both music and sound design, and I really love when I get to do both, and I have sort of creative direction of both disciplines on my projects. I'm currently living in Berlin, Germany, but I'm from the US. And right now you can see a couple different projects that I've worked on, as well as like my 2 cats on the far right there. They're very cute. And one of them just said something. I don't know if you could hear her. So a little about me. I got my start in game audio back at college. I went to Berklee College of Music, where I was a film scoring major, and I also did a video game scoring minor. After that, I moved to LA. I did some internships at Remote Control Productions, but pretty quickly I pivoted into games, and I started working on some thesis, like master projects from some students from USC. And then I kind of never looked back at film ever again. And now I just do games. So what is Life Below? Probably a lot of you haven't heard of the game because it's not out yet, but it's coming out next week on the 26th. So if you like anything that you see in this talk, go ahead and wishlist and hopefully maybe play the game when it comes out. But Life Below is a underwater city or reef builder game where the player, via a character named Thalassa, is tasked with rebuilding and restoring balance to a desolate coral reef ecosystem. And the way they do this is by strategically building and managing various coral reef buildings and luring wildlife back to each zone. So there are 6 different types of biomes in the game, each of which have their own challenges to manage. The aesthetic, as you can see, is a balance between sort of being inspired by real coral reef elements, but also fantasy elements. The health of your reef is ultimately controlled by the large blue structure you see in the center, which is called the reef heart. And the reef heart basically controls the health, comfort, etc. of the whole ecosystem. And there are game fail conditions if the reef heart's health or comfort falls too low. The style of the game provided a lot of opportunities for super interesting audio research and also some challenges. For one, how do you create a full soundscape of underwater life while keeping a balanced mix? Do fish even make sounds? Which, spoiler alert, they do in fact make sounds. How to create interactivity in the music system to have different personality for each biome without creating an exponentially difficult and large amount of work. We had some additional implementation challenges from using Unity's DOTS, which is data-oriented technology stack. So the wildlife and many of the things in the game, or yeah, most things in the game weren't using like traditional game objects. For this talk, particular, I'm mostly going to focus on the important adaptive audio elements, including ambience, environment sounds, and music. And here I have a video just of sort of some regular gameplay, so you can get a feel for what that is like and what the audio as a whole is sounding like. Um, I believe now you're hearing things in stereo on this platform. It was going to be mono, but I think it's stereo now, so that's nice. Uh, so I'll go ahead and play that. Probably enough of an overview of sort of what the gameplay looks like, what the audio is sounding like. And now we can talk a little bit about some of the inspiration for getting started creating the soundscape for this game. Early in the project, we contacted marine biologists to see if we could get some authentic materials of what coral reefs actually sounded like. And we were lucky to get some really clear files that we could use for reference. I'm going to go ahead and play this first file of a degraded reef. And then this is a healthy reef. And one more healthy reef. So you can hear in the first degraded reef file, mostly just some crackling and not much else. And then when you compare that to the healthy reef files, it's obvious how much more life is there. You have like the crackling of shrimp and a little symphony of fish and just plenty of sounds. These files became the kind of backbone and core reference for me for the types of textures and sounds that make up underwater life, and also highlighted the importance of the contrasting silence when a reef is not healthy. And the balance between sound and silence remained a sort of core design focus for me throughout the games. It's a direct translation from what happens in real life when a reef isn't sustaining life. So it became very important that the audio was giving a sense of life returning to the ecosystems, but also being taken away during challenging parts of the game or when you first enter a new biome and it's quite empty. And ultimately, I came to the conclusion that everything we hear in the game would sort of end up contributing to the feel of a real coral reef. So the ambience, the environmental sounds, all the way like extending into player action sounds, sprite actions, and more. So the first step in creating the soundscape was a backdrop of 2D ambiences. In Life Below, we have 6 different biome types which a player can build in. That is rocky, volcanic, Arctic, coastal, ruined, and barren. I decided to modify the ambiences based on 2 parameters. If you see at the top, we have dynamic level and biome labeled. But basically, that is the dynamic level is reacting to how built a player's biome is, and we set it to go from low, medium, high based on certain percentages of built in the biome. And then the biome parameter, of course, is connected to which biome the player is building in. Each ambience is made up of 3 parts. A base layer, which is basically just sort of muted noise between 100 and 2K hertz. A deeper layer with frequencies from 20 to 200. And then a biome and intensity layer, which is giving the specific zone we're in its personality, and also indicating how built or not built the reef is. I split it up like this because I wanted each ambience to share common layers and have a base that kept continuity between each biome. And I wanted to make sure that the biome ambience layers occupied some higher frequencies so the character of each biome could be felt more and not sort of get lost in the muddy lower end of frequencies that yeah, when you think of underwater sounds, you think of like sounds that are steeply low passed at around like 3 or 4K. Yeah, and so I'm going to show this video so you can see a little bit how I set it up and how the ambience changes from different parameters. It was relatively simple to set up. This is like one of the first things that I made at the beginning of the project, and then I think I never really had to tweak it again, so that was really nice. I'm using event instruments to transition between the different dynamic intensities and biome-specific ambiences. So inside these biome event instruments are the 3 different intensity levels specific to that biome. And then I use magnet regions with a transition between different parameter values. And altogether, there are 18 different background ambiences with 3 intensities per biome. So probably you can hear it sounds like a very natural transition between them. None of the biomes are so distinctly different that it's like kind of jarring. And that is what I wanted because in the game we are moving sometimes very rapidly between different biomes. So it's definitely a decision to try to help make sure both in ambience and in music, which I'll talk about later, that the audio experience feels cohesive and has continuity essentially. The next step for me was to focus on what I call the world building sounds, um, or 3D building sounds. And these are basically the corals that you place to grow and manage your zone. There were several considerations when creating audio for these, like which buildings should get sound, what kind of sounds, how often should they make sound, how do we affect the sounds according to different game conditions like building health and comfort. The main idea for these sounds was to help give the feeling that the reef is coming back to life as you build more and more corals. So I decided to focus mostly on organic textures, similar to what I heard in the coral reef reference files. But I also included some non-realistic textures as well for variety, because I wanted it to be a bit more than just kind of crackling textures. Pretty quickly, I decided that not every building could have a sound, because that would be super chaotic and taxing. And there are certain corals that you place more often than others. So I decided to focus specifically on unique looking corals that are placed more sporadically. And ultimately, I chose only 9 buildings to emit sound, which sounds like very few. But when multiple are placed in a zone in combination with the 2D ambiences, other environment sounds, player construction sounds, wildlife sounds, etc., it feels appropriate. And most of these sounds were made with natural textures. I remember using seaweed and pretzels to get some crackling source material, as well as ice, plastic, rocks, stuff like that. I set up most of these sounds to be looping multi-instruments with a trigger percentage. So most of them don't emit sound all the time, although there are a few that do, but rather there's a little bit of randomization to them and also space to make it feel more organic. There are a couple of these sounds that we were able to time exactly with the visuals of the coral making the sound. Like there's a clam that essentially opens and closes and a growth coral that has little like spark particles, because these have obvious indications of when the sound should happen, but the rest just play sporadically. I'll go through a couple so you can hear some of these. These are harder to show off because of the trigger percentage. Okay. Next category of sounds I focused on is what I call environment sounds, things that are static in the environment, unrelated to what the player is building. I also sometimes call them 3D ambience elements because I just think of them as things that help develop the backdrop of ambient sounds, but give more depth and spatialization to whatever biome we're in. So for life below, these included things like the lava geysers you can see now, different types of hydrothermal vents, silt storms, acid clouds, alkaline clouds, and then heat and cold layers as well. And here's a couple of those. And we also have special events that happen in the game environment that also contribute sound. These can be either positive, neutral, or negative events, although largely they are sort of negative hazards. These are also important to filling out the underwater soundscape and are additional opportunities to layer different textures on top of the other environmental sounds. So some of the events could be jellyfish swarms, oil clouds, trash clouds, heat waves, cold currents, sea urchin infestation, algae bloom, alkaline clouds, acid clouds, marine wildlife visits. We have like whales and sharks that come, and sea turtles sometimes, I think. The trash, jellyfish, and oil events were interesting because they span a large distance across the environment and they also travel across different biomes. So initially, when implementing the loops for these, we ran into challenges making sure that the sound and visuals were aligned, especially with their min and max distance. And we had some situations, for example, where we could hear the trash but couldn't see it, or vice versa. And eventually, we adjusted the listener position uh, to be more center to the player's perspective rather than where the camera transform actually was. Because on the camera, which is actually situated like 3 zones below the zone we're looking at, we would end up hearing the events much louder when they pass below you than when they're actually in front of you. So this took a bit of trial and error to make the moving hazards feel sort of diegetic to the environment. And this is probably the most fun category of sounds that make up the soundscape, the fish and wildlife sounds. So, the fish were exceptionally interesting for me because I am not sure I was actually aware that fish made sounds before I worked on this project. But it turns out that most fish, in fact, can make sounds as long as the fish has a swim bladder. And some fish have 2 swim bladders, I learned. Uh, but yeah, as long as the fish has a swim bladder, it can make a sound. And the swim bladder is an organ that fills up with air and mainly helps the fish regulate its buoyancy underwater. The swim bladder gets contracted by a sonic muscle, which is usually either on or near the swim bladder. And the contraction of the swim bladder, which is again filled with air, is what makes a variety of different sounds. Can be like drumming, clicks, pulses, growls, purrs. It's not really correct to say that fish vocalize since it has nothing to do with vocal cords. It's all about the swim bladder. They they bladderize. Okay, that was a bad joke. That's not in my notes. I shouldn't have said that. All right, anyway. And most of the fish sounds produced from this contraction range anywhere from 45 to 1,000 hertz. Um, and I was also lucky enough to get some real fish sounds from the marine biologists we contacted early in the project. And though I didn't put any of these in the project, they were super useful for reference. So I'm going to play some of these. I think they're pretty cool. And it's crazy how diverse the sounds can be for the basically having the same method of producing it. Um, Sadly, fish sounds are relatively under-researched at the moment. So when it came for me to design them, sometimes I could find real references and sometimes I could not. But from the real references I had, it was pretty easy to sort of group them into different categories of sound. Um, so I have some more fish sounds, but these are ones that I made for the project. And also in parentheses is the source material I used to make it. Yeah, so taking from what I learned about how fish actually make sound via muscle contraction and the real recordings, I could basically extrapolate other categories and types of sounds that they could make, and did a variety of those while keeping them roughly within the 40 to 1K range I mentioned. So this is a blue stripe snapper that I used by like clicking my tongue like that. I don't know if you could hear that, but yeah, that. Yellow boxfish, which was my voice. Lumpfish, also my voice. Green chromis used a little ratchet percussion thing. Giant grouper, I used faceplant. Fox-faced rabbitfish, I used a bird recording. Coral grouper, again faceplant. Clown goby, my voice again. And clownfish, another bird. I think the clownfish were my favorite. And clownfish actually sound like that. That is like a real reference. The fish audio system was a bit challenging because of the scale of the wildlife simulation. We could potentially have hundreds or thousands of fish active at once, so playing sounds per individual fish would quickly become chaotic. So instead, my audio programmer Fingar built a system that looks at clusters of nearby fish and treats them more like schools. And from there, you could analyze things like group size, fish type, and velocity to decide when and how sounds should play. And that let us drive audio based on the behavior of the group rather than individual fish, which made the soundscape feel much more natural and controllable. As a sort of sequence of steps basically looks like: 1, collect fish data, read nearby fish positions, movement type, and burst activity. 2, build chunks, group nearby fish into spatial chunks and summarize their behavior. 3, create schools, merge fish moving together into larger audio groups. And 4, drive audio playback, use the group's behavior to determine which sounds should play, where they should come from, and when to trigger it. So I'm going to play a video with only fish sounds soloed. Looking for fish. Yeah, so altogether, these were the biggest groups of sounds that make up the soundscape of life below. And I have just one more video here with all of them turned on, so you can now sort of listen and pay attention for the different things. And yeah, I go through a couple different biomes with different levels of completion. And yeah, I'm just gonna play it. The other really impactful adaptive audio system that I worked on was the background music. We decided pretty early on in development that we wanted the music to be adaptive, but the question was how. We floated different ideas like different tracks per biome or music that builds in intensity based on game progress. But there were obvious considerations like exactly how many biomes would we eventually have, because depending on the method we use, that could become exponentially more and more work. As the game continued to develop, it became super clear that players would be often moving between the zones and sometimes quite rapidly. So the idea to have different tracks per biome no longer made sense, and we settled on overarching tracks that would adapt to the current biome the player was in. I then made it slightly more complicated by also adjusting the arrangement according to intensity, either low, medium, or high. So with 6 biomes and 3 intensities, altogether each background track has 18 variations, which brings the total tracks for just background music to 90 because we have 5 main themes. The idea of adjusting the music depending on the intensity level, which in this game correlates with how many corals a player has built in each individual biome, was to make the experience dynamic for the player. When we first enter a reef that is super empty, the music is really minimal and sparse, and as players build more and more and attract more wildlife to their reef, the music evolves to become more complex as well. I really love that the system devolves with the reef as well. If you have a hazard that comes through and decimates your reef, both the ambience and music systems will adjust as well. And I also really liked that this helped give us a feeling of change from biome to biome, and from one zone to the next, you can have a very different musical experience and mood. So for the different biome arrangements, I tried to align instrumentation with a specific feel for each zone, as well as stay with the already defined musical, stay within the already defined musical palette for the game. I treated the coastal biome as a sort of default normal instrumentation because it is also the normal biome in the game. I wanted the volcanic biome to feel tactile and physical, so I gravitated towards hang drum and marimba. The rocky biome felt similar to volcanic to me, so that was initially a bit of a struggle, but later I found an awesome like tuned percussion instrument, DST, that became the backbone for its melodic instruments. I chose clear metal instruments for the Arctic biome, Celeste and Umbira. I wanted the last 2 biomes, Barren and Ruin, to stand out a little bit. And each piece, these two biomes variations differ the most from the main track by changing the arrangement more than just swapping melody instruments. The defining feature of the barren zone is that it's super empty, and I wanted to reflect that in the music by having it be much more minimal and choosing plucked instruments to give even more space. The ruined zones are defined by a decay that persists throughout the zone and slowly decays your corals until you heal the reef in the biome. So I wanted to use instruments that sounded imperfect and a little atonal. For this one in particular, I leaned heavily on a sampled instrument I made from one of my metal water bottles because the harmonics were, I don't know, really good. So I have a video to show how I've set this up in FMOD. I tried several different methods of implementation, but this is the one that I ended up on for a couple of reasons. I first wanted to have more flexibility inside of the event and format it to a percussion stem, main harmony stem, bass stem, and melody stem. But about a year into development, we started running into transition lag issues with overlapping and out of sync instruments. And I ended up remixing, bouncing, and formatting all of the stems and events to be standalone assets, as you see in the video. I lost a little bit of flexibility in regards to individual transitions, but the stability of the events was a lot better. So in FMOD, each background event looks a bit like what you're seeing. I used magnet regions with, I think, a 1 or 2 bar transition between each region. It's just crossfading. And then you'll see me swapping the 2 parameters up top for intensity and biome. One of the challenges of setting it up like this was balancing the mix between each of these 18 different tracks. I tried as much as possible during mixing in my DAW to keep everything at similar levels. But with 90 total tracks, sometimes there were discrepancies between volume levels. And because the content of the tracks changes so much, there were discrepancies between the lowest intensities and higher intensities in terms of how they actually felt in game. So I tried to adjust this by adding volume to increase or decrease. Adding a parameter to increase or decrease volume. No, adding automation to increase or decrease volume by intensity. So for example, the lowest tracks play at 0 dB, medium plays at -1, and high plays at -2. That's what I ended up sticking with. But occasionally I still hear that increase in volume going from maybe high to low intensities when transitioning. So if I had all the time in the world, I would probably go back yet again and iterate and try to make that smoother. All right, I'm going to play so you can hear some of the different biome flavors, I guess. Um, Actually getting this system to feel good in Engine was another long challenge, and this went through multiple iterations over like 2 years. The biggest considerations were how long should the transitions between tracks be, when should we transition, how long should each track play, and how much silence should be in between. The first issue transitions changed a couple different times. It was challenging to find a balance between being responsive to camera movements and not causing chaos, swapping between different variations immediately every time we were on the edge of a biome. Too slow of a transition made it seem laggy and like a bug, and too fast was a bit too abrupt. At some point, we realized we needed a better system for determining which biome we were actually focused on. As I mentioned a bit earlier, because of the listener and camera position, we would trigger the biome below the one we were actually looking at too easily. So my audio programmer came up with a better system to trigger the appropriate biome according to a projection from the camera's location instead of the listener's location instead of its actual location. And even near the end of development, we were still making improvements to the system to make it as smooth and intuitive as possible. Eventually, we also added a stability timer, which would check if we were in a specific biome longer than 2 seconds before committing to a new parameter. And this helped smooth out the experience of like panning over large expanses of different biomes. And we also added a variable duration of silence between tracks to give players a bit of a break from wall-to-wall music. Because I wanted the music to feel like more organic in the game rather than something sort of sitting on top of other sounds. And now I will play how the music sounds soloed in game. What I forgot to mention, when we're panning over multiple biomes, what we decided to do was hold the last values of the last biome we were like in for longer than 2 seconds, so the music won't change so rapidly. Finally, I want to talk about some mixing challenges and just in general challenges I encountered on this project. First is maybe obvious, but when working on an underwater game, turns out if everything sounds like it's underwater and made of bubbles, it feels very flat and confusing. Um, to make something sound like it's underwater for human ears kind of means low passing at around 3 or 4K hertz and cutting off a good third of the frequency spectrum. On top of this, my objective for the background music was also to not be very obtrusive, to feel natural and non-fatiguing, and could easily blend into the soundscape if I chose too many muted or water-inspired textures. So I tried to find places where I could try to fill out the whole frequency spectrum across the game soundscape and use different textures to provide some contrast. I roughly decided that a lot of gameplay sound effects and ambience would feel underwater and more diegetic to the game environment, while HUD, UI, and notification sounds could stand out a little bit more. I had done a lot of hydrophone recordings, which became the basis of a lot of the sounds in the game. And these also naturally have a frequency cutoff, or sometimes also like unnatural tinny sounding frequencies in the high end, which need to be cut out. And doing some really simple fixes like getting rid of harsh frequencies, adding bright saturation, using transient shapers to clean up the shape of the sounds, and heavily relying on limiters to squish and almost normalize the sounds really helped the source material feel more clear and stand out. So in this video, you'll hear the difference between the starting source material and how it evolves as I go through the signal chain. And I ended up using similar signal chains and processes for a lot of the sound effects that made it into the game. I also have a video of some of the worker sounds and notification sounds. So you can hear a difference in the style and mix between the more diegetic worker sounds and less diegetic notification sounds. Also, I think I forgot to mention that I was also using like a water splash impulse response for a lot of the notification sounds to make them feel a bit more special. It kind of added a nice little plunk texture to the sounds. Oops. I also ran into some difficulties in trying to get the HUD sounds like notifications, quest complete, quest accepted, and so on to feel tied to the actual button or action that was happening. Often there would be multiple sources of information happening at once, like a notification on the right side, quest task completed on the left side, tutorial box pop up somewhere else. And it was really a challenge to try to get all of this information more clear via sound. I also wanted to keep audio accessibility in mind, so it became important that each type of HUD sound was unique to try to distinguish them from one another. I also made the decision to add some amount of spatialization to the sounds to help place them on the screen so they didn't feel so disembodied. And this took some trial and error because most of the time we didn't want the sound to emit from the panel or button's actual transform location, or for many things we were not able to. And the other consideration was I didn't want these elements panned too far away from center, just enough that the panning might help connect the sound to the object it's related to. So these UI elements are positioned in screen space in Unity, where UI elements and their positions are managed in pixels or percentage of screen size. But FMOD Spatializer works with world space. Um, and because of how the UI elements were set up in screen space, they would sound way too far away and panned too far out if we tried to attach the event emitter to the actual location. Um, and would be a bit finicky to try to make it sound good. And we didn't want to spawn audio at positions around the listener and then sort of trial and error those spatial differences and distances, and then also make sure that they continue to follow the camera. So our solution was to just split the screen in two from -1 on the left to +1 on the right, which would map perfectly with a panning parameter from FMOD. So for certain sounds that move around the screen space, like box pop-ups, they're using a panning parameter, while other UI elements that stay static in their location are just using a panning effect. And with this solution, I was able to easily control the max panning for each sound as well via the parameter or the effect, which would be way easier than doing trial and error in Unity. Something really cool that I found out about how sound works underwater is that sound waves actually move much faster, like 4.5 times faster underwater than they do in air. So sound ends up traveling both faster and farther in the ocean than it would on land. So I thought about how underwater creatures use sound to communicate, for echolocation, and more, and wanted to use sounds that were very clear and can ring out for a long time. So I gravitated towards clear metallic tones and melodic instruments that would occupy more of the mid and high frequency ranges. And as I mentioned earlier, I was also drawn to really tactile and physical sounds in addition to soft, flowy, reverby sounds, especially in the lower intensity music levels. I paid a lot of attention to making sure that silence was part of the composition to leave space in the wider mix for other sounds, and instruments like marimba, hang drum, plucked piano helped me achieve that. And as my sort of final wrap up, I just want to say I was able to do so many fun things on this project because I was given the time and resources to do so. I was very lucky that my team at Megapop really valued audio and made it a priority. I had a lot of creative liberties and decision-making responsibility. And I was also given a dedicated audio programmer who was really interested in and curious about audio and making it the best he possibly could. So, although, of course, most of you listening are probably audio people, I feel it's important to emphasize that we can really only do in-depth creative work when audio is taken seriously and we're given the appropriate resources to do so. So I will also just give a quick thank you to the team at Megapop for creating an environment that allowed audio to be a priority. And that is all I have for today. So I hope that y'all liked it and it was useful to see the process. And if you have any questions, I think Greg is going to mediate them for us.
Thank you so much, Julie. This was fantastic. So much research that went into it. I had no idea how fish made sounds, or that they made sounds in the first place. So really enjoyed it. And yeah, the people watching as well, the chat was great. People really, really enjoyed it. We are nearly at time, so I think we can squeeze 1 or 2 questions in. The rest will go into the Hangout space as usual. I'll link it soon. So one of the things we had is 2 questions about basically hydrophones. So one was, how did you record the underwater transition? And 2, did you use hydrophones in any capacity during the recording?
Yes. I think I said at some point I used a lot of hydrophone recordings. Hydrophone recordings make up probably like at least 60% of the sounds that are in this game, at least by asset percentage wise. I used a very cheap one, like the ones that are like 10 or like 20 euros, that are just contact mics coated in like some wax. They're not the best quality mics, but they did the job with the like signal flow or signal chain processes that I put them through, the original recordings, that they turned out really well. And
Fantastic.
so yeah, those were also used in the transition sounds, and then also some non-hydrophone water recordings.
Yeah, they're really, really nice. I love the tactility, and just loads of people said ASMR basically, and that's what it felt like. It was so pleasant and just really nice to listen to it. Especially I switched between speakers and headphones. So ooh, this is great on headphones. Lovely. Someone asked as well what DAW you are using.
I'm a Reaper girl.
Perfect. And then how long was the full development cycle that you were on this project?
I was on for about 3 years. The game cycle was a bit longer. I think they were working at least like a year or so before I joined.
Fantastic. Yeah, that's a good chunk of time as well. And I mean,
Yes.
really impressive, all the work and effort that went into this.
Thank you.
Incredible presentation. And someone just said this talk was definitely my favorite one so far. Thank you, Julie. This was amazing.
Thank
Fish
you.
noises. I totally agree. It's been absolutely fantastic having you on and sharing all of this. So thank you so much. And thank you everyone for joining in, making funny fish jokes and all of that kind of stuff, and being great as always. And yeah, thank you all so much for tuning in. Thank you again, Julie. Really appreciate it.
Thank you, everyone.
We will see you in the next one. Bye-bye.
Bye.